All right. So the name of my talk today is Anti-Choice, Controlling Pregnancy Throughout History. And if you get nothing else out of this talk, just get that the not just rhetorically best way to describe abortion as a policy and debate in this country is anti-choice. That is rhetorically true, but it's also true throughout history, just as a matter of fact. In order to frame abortion as a debate between two equal and equally respectable moral positions, what you have to do is be willing to ignore the context of basically all of history as it applies to anti-choice policies. So I'm not just going to be talking about abortion. I'm going to talk about that. But I'm also going to talk about contraceptives, sterilization, pregnancy, and birth. So on a reproductive level, some of these policies are pro-natalist, others are anti-natalist. But that's not the division you want to think about. You want to think about who gets to have the decision about whether or not they become or stay pregnant. Is it the person themselves, or is it someone else? And ultimately, when you hear someone talk about a concern for life, this is just fundamentally not true. They may not realize it's not true, but it's not. To get to that, I'm going to tell you about a guy named Maddox. So back in the late 19th or late 20th century, from like 1999 to 2004, he had a website called The Best Page in the Universe. He called it that. And he had a character who was an asshole. He was supposed to be an asshole, right? And he would write articles like, "I'm better at art than your kids," and making fun of like kindergartners and stuff, right? Yeah. But in 2004, he said he wanted to start the Regressive Party. And the point of the Regressive Party is he wanted no one to be happy. So he said his position on abortion is, I'm against abortion, but for killing babies. The only way that I'd be pro-choice is if it meant that I could choose which babies I could abort, right? Now that sounds hyperbolic and extreme, and he was trying to be kind of an ironic, hyper-masculine person. He also said in that same article that, of course, we're going to take away women's right to vote, right? So that character, though, attracted some people who liked it at face value. But more than that, that formulation, I'm going to argue to you, is actually a more accurate way to look at abortion as it exists now and throughout history. I'm against abortion, but for killing babies. I'm only for abortion if I get to decide which babies get aborted. Okay. This has actually existed in history. Okay. If you look back in time at the Assyrian Empire, they were not nice people. They're not typically known to be the nicest people in all of history. But this is how they addressed abortion in their criminal code. They said, if a woman aborts her own unborn child and she has been charged and convicted, she is to be impaled and not buried. If she died during the abortion, she is still to be impaled and not buried. If some woman hit her when she had the abortion and did not report to the king, it gets cut off. Presumably she is also punished. So they're very strongly anti-abortion. Is that because they care about life? Clearly not. Is it because they care about infants? No. There was one of their kings, Tiglath-Pileser I. He bragged about this. He went to a city that had not submitted to them, and this is what is described on the segment. He slits the wombs of the pregnant women. He blinds the infants. So they bragged about the fact that they killed infants. They were against abortion, but pro-killing babies, right? Because the important thing is not life, it is who gets to make the decision about reproduction. We oftentimes hear people frame their justification for being anti-abortion as being Judeo-Christian values. But there is only one reference to abortion in the entirety of the Bible, Hebrew and Christian, and it is in Numbers 5. And essentially what it says is that if you are a man, your spouse is pregnant, and you think that she may have cheated on you, what you can do is take her to the priest, and the priest will have her drink a mixture of ash and water, And if she has a miscarriage, then she was guilty. If she doesn't, then she wasn't, right? So the only reference to abortion in the Bible is that you can force your spouse to have one to prove that she cheated on you. And yet, this is actually not so different from the Assyrians, because the important thing is that the pregnant person has no say in the matter. They don't get to decide whether they stay pregnant or not. Someone else does. That is the main difference in all of these policies regarding reproduction. Okay. In history, though, forced abortion is actually pretty rare. I tried to find examples where it might be. The closest ones that I could find was that in ancient Greece, a kyrios, or a master of someone, he could force his enslaved person to have an abortion because maybe she's a dancer, maybe they did acting or something, and he wanted to keep making money off of her. That's about the only reason, or the only time in history that you explicitly had that ability. But most of the time, you would just wait until there was a birth. In Greece, you could actually kill a baby before it had been recognized as a free person. It wasn't a person yet, right? Like personhood as an idea is kind of fungible. And so you could legally kill an infant, or you could expose them, and that way you wouldn't take the blame for it. And today, sex traffickers, they might force someone to have an abortion for kind of the same reasons, that they view this as a person who is giving them economic value and they don't want to have that interrupted. Or it could be something like nuns who are sexually assaulted in the Vatican are sometimes forced to have an abortion so they don't reveal that a priest abused them. But as a matter of state policy, forced abortion doesn't seem to happen. I expected, actually, for the one-child policy of the People's Republic of China to be a counterexample, but it really wasn't. There are restrictions on how many children you can have, and there's punishments. So people tend to choose not to have more than 2 kids and face the punishments. But it wouldn't really be fair to call the United States or the UK pro-forced abortion countries either, even though we have a policy of doing that in specific cases. An example of this would be for people with disabilities. So in the case Doe ex rel Tarlow v. DC, there were 3 Jane Does with intellectual disabilities who said they were subjected to forcible surgical procedures in the 1970s to the 1990s while they were under the institutional care of a administrative agency in DC. And the person who upheld on appeal the idea that you can force these people to have abortions even if they don't want to was Brett Kavanaugh, right? So Brett Kavanaugh will probably try to take that away from most other people, but as long as someone else is making the decision, it's okay, right? We're against abortion, we're pro-killing babies, we're only for abortion if we get to decide what happens to them. Sterilization is much more common than forced abortion in modern times for some obvious reasons. And it didn't used to exist in the past because we didn't have the medical understanding to remove the ability of pregnant people to become pregnant permanently until the late 19th and early 20th century. Prior to that, we did have castration, but I'm leaving that outside of this talk because it's kind of its own thing. And in the United States, this movement started under things like the Societies for the Protection of the Feeble-Minded, right? So sterilization is something that came from the United States, particularly from California, as part of the eugenicist movement. And we sterilized about 70,000 people in the United States in the 20th century. So 70,000 people were made to have the decision, someone else made the decision for them, that they could no longer reproduce, they could no longer become pregnant. When you think, though, about eugenics, you probably think about Nazi Germany, and rightfully so. They were inspired by the United States. They forcibly sterilized, I think, about 300,000, hundreds of thousands of people. They also murdered in the name of euthanasia, hundreds of thousands of people, right? And this was because they didn't think that disabled people, which they defined as manic depressives and the deaf, should be able to make the decision of whether or not they wanted to reproduce. While that's awful, right, what it came from the United States was the progressive movement. This idea that with science, with our ability to make progress, we could create a better social health, right? It had a long tail to it, to the extent that in Canada, even though they repealed these coercive sterilization laws, those continue to affect Indigenous people up until the last one in 2017, right? So these are things that continue to exist. The important thing is not whether or not someone is sterilized, it's who gets to make that decision. And historically, even in the United States, that has been the case, that someone else is making the decision. Another Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, this year in the case Box v. Planned Parenthood of Indiana and Kentucky, wrote a concurring opinion that didn't really have anything to do with contraceptives. It just had to do with what to do with fetal remains, that's what they called it. And he wrote in that opinion that there's a compelling interest in preventing abortion to become a tool of modern day eugenics. He also talked about contraceptives in the same way, as being modern day eugenics. And in that, he tried to tie Planned Parenthood's founder, Margaret Sanger, to all of these awful things that had happened here and other places. And yet, he misses, again, this fundamental point. What is it about contraceptives that is good or bad? It's who is making the decision. It is not the thing itself, the technology. It's who gets to make the decision about themselves. And when you look at, in the United States, our own anti-contraceptive policies, they have their own pretty terrible history too. So Margaret Sanger had to flee to Europe in 1914 to escape arrest because of things called the Comstock laws. Has anyone heard of Comstock laws before? Yeah. It was named after Anthony Comstock. He was a moral scold who, I don't know what to call him except a misogynist. He didn't like women, he didn't like women's bodily autonomy. The historian Eric Loomis describes the Comstock laws this way. They were enacted in 1873, and they were designed to oppress anyone talking about sex in any way, especially people giving advice around birth control. He became the head of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. He would not allow medical textbooks showing accurate depictions of the human body to be sent through the US mail, among other things. Comstock literally laughed when the prosecutions his laws caused against birth control providers caused them to commit suicide. He openly wrote letters about how great this was, especially when the New York provider Ida Craddock killed herself for being targeted by Comstock, and wrote a long suicide note blaming him in particular for her decision to commit suicide. The same with prominent abortionist Madame Restell, who killed herself after Comstock had her arrested in 1878. He was a terrible human being. He later bragged about all of the 4,000 people he had arrested, and of that, 15 had killed themselves. So that is the birth control movement in the United States, is that sort of person. And his laws continued to hurt people long after his death in 1915. So there are other ways that controlling people's bodily autonomy has existed in the past. But the one that we face today is forced birth, right? It is someone who has become pregnant being forced to give birth. And abortion was not illegal for free women in the United States until the late 19th century. What that means is that it was not considered to be that important of a thing. But what happened was that as medical science got better in the 19th century, doctors found out that an idea of quickening wasn't actually that important medically. There wasn't a huge difference between what was happening to fetal development before and after that. And because most of these people were men and they couldn't get pregnant, they decided that we should become more restrictive with laws, not less. But it was really driven by concerns that there were too many immigrants that were coming into the country. And although those immigrants were white, they were the wrong kind of white. They were Catholic, and they were having too many babies. In the late 1980s, you saw a similar thing start to happen called the birth dearth, which means that the wrong people are having too many kids. The right people aren't having enough. Therefore, we need to encourage and restrict some people to have more babies, other people less. Iowa Republican Steve King recently said, a couple years ago, we can't restore our civilization with someone else's babies. So what that means is that you need to do as much as you can to ensure that the right kind of white people are having lots of babies and the other people are not. That is the direct lineage that anti-abortionists in the United States are a part of. There's no real concern with life in any of this. It's about controlling people's bodies, and it's about a racist civilizational struggle. This is a thing that affects us, but patriarchy and misogyny express themselves without any, there's no restraint in terms of whether one religion will feel this way or non-religion, or an economic system. The unfortunate thing about patriarchy and misogyny is that they show up everywhere you look, in history, in basically every country. So the United States sterilizing people, it considered undesirable. It's the thing that we did. Nazi Germany sterilized people, we know, right? They also were pro-forced birth for Aryans, right? They wanted Aryan women to have lots and lots of babies. And the reason this is so is because they reduced people who could give birth to their reproductive capacity. The most important thing that they considered a woman to do was have sons who could grow up, become soldiers, fight and die for the German state, and then have girls who could be mothers, raise kids, and have lots more babies. They reduced people to their reproductive ability, and then wanted to control and manage that. You see the same thing from Italy. They had it's called the Battle of the Births. They wanted to have more Italian women having more babies, right? This is not pro-life. This is not a pro-life movement. This is an anti-choice movement. They want to be the ones that are making the decisions. If you look at Germany after World War II, West Germany actually kept a lot of these Nazi laws that restricted the ability to advertise about abortions. Like, those are still on the books today, right? So fascist government becomes democratic government, but that democratic government continues laws that are anti-choice. Meanwhile, East Germany is communist, but in this one way was actually more free, right? They expanded the number of exceptions to these abortion bans, so you were better off if you were someone who'd become pregnant living in East Germany than West Germany, right? However, this is not universally true. Are communists better at reproductive rights than other people? The answer is no. We are mostly aware of the fact that there's a one-child policy in China that started in the 70s, I think late 70s. But prior to that, in the 1950s and 60s, China had an anti-abortion policy. The goal of the state was to have lots and lots more children, right? So what changed between the 50s and the 60s to the 70s and 80s? Was it that the People's Republic of China suddenly cared or didn't care about life? No, they just didn't care about the people who become pregnant. They never cared about the people who become pregnant, and so they could change the policy to suit whatever they needed. The state that I'm aware of in history with the most pro-natalist, anti-abortion, anti-contraceptive policies is not a Catholic one. It is communist Romania. So abortion was illegal up until 1957, but from 57 to 1966, it was communist and it was legal to have abortions. However, due to a lack of access to contraceptives, about 80% of all pregnancies ended in abortion, right? Then, in 1967, the country's leader, Nicolae Ceausescu, outlawed it with Decree 770. And what it meant was that it was a criminal violation to have an abortion if you were not older than the age of 45, if you hadn't already had 4 kids, if your life would not be threatened, if the fetus was not malformed, or if the person didn't get pregnant through rape or incest. I don't know why there was always those two things, because it seemed like the first one's enough, but that shows up in laws a lot. Okay, so that was Decree 770, and for the next about 20 years, what you saw was hundreds of thousands of children being born who weren't wanted. They couldn't be taken care of. They were abandoned in the streets. They were put into orphanages. Women were inspected regularly to make sure that they weren't hiding a pregnancy, to make sure they were still menstruating, right? This society had that little regard for people who could become pregnant. And the effect of this policy was a sudden transition from a birth rate of 14.3 per 1,000 in 1966 to the very next year, 27.4. So from 14.3 to 27.4, because so many people who weren't planning and didn't want to have kids suddenly had to. Was this effective at raising the birth rate? The answer is no, because by 1983, it had fallen back down to 14.3. So it went back down by 1983 what it had been before, except with much, much more suffering and disruption of people's lives. So there's one more forced birth culture that we need to talk about, and that is American slavery. Because before I said that free Americans didn't have their reproductive autonomy that messed with. That's certainly not true for enslaved people. So in the past, we've often heard it said before that women were practically slaves. And that's how we describe marriages and how they could live and own property. And we say, in the past, women were basically slaves. And what that forgets, of course, is that many of the people who were enslaved in history were women, and they had no rights. And in the hyper-capitalism of American chattel slavery, people who were held in bondage were not considered people, but basically animated objects. So abuse that they suffered was not really considered abuse. You didn't have a choice about whether or not you would become pregnant at all. And sometimes this was because a slaver, an owner, would commit sexual assault, but more often it was because you were forced to cohabitate with someone you didn't choose and forced to breed because the stock would be good. That is how it was considered. And in this case, abortion was not allowed, not because of a concern for life, but because it represented wealth. So abortion in the United States was mainly illegal, mainly disallowed due to American slavery. It would not be accurate to call that a great concern for life and desire for respecting life when those offspring could be trafficked off somewhere else, could be abused, tortured, killed without any consequences whatsoever. So we often default to the framing of debate of the right. And that is why we look at it now as being pro-life versus pro-choice, right? But this is not at all true, and you should never respect it. Because throughout all of history, there has never been a great concern for life that has mattered when we restrict people's own bodies. It is always about who gets to decide who's important and who's not. When we say that, I've used that quote a few times, but it is very true that there is no actual concern for a life when you say you don't want abortion to be allowed. And when you get into a debate with someone who is against abortion, and you have that debate about when life begins, you will never convince that person. All of the medical science in the world will never convince them to change their mind because they don't actually care about when life begins. Judith Thompson, right? Judith Jarvis Thompson had a great philosophical essay about what if you woke up and you were connected doing basically dialysis for a violinist who was going to die if you get disconnected, and talking about how even if that person is a life, that doesn't overwhelm your own bodily autonomy and right to exist. But that will never convince someone who is against abortion because they don't actually care about life. What they care about is controlling someone else. If they cared about these things, pointing out the hypocrisy of arresting someone who tests positive for cocaine when they have a baby because you're poisoning a child, but they don't care about poisoning a city full of people with lead and water would be effective. But it's not actually about that. The thing that's always important is we think that we should decide what happens to this class of people's bodies because they're not fully human themselves. And when you look back at the ways in which this has existed throughout time, it doesn't matter whether it is forcing sterilizations on people, whether it's taking contraceptives away, whether it is forcing them not to have abortions, or whether it's forcing, in the case of like those Greek slaves, to have abortions. The important thing is always who is considered a person and who's not. And so when you want to have a political debate, don't listen to the words that are being said, because those actually aren't the most important thing. You want to talk about what is this underlying and fundamental reality that has existed basically in all societies and all time, and that is a complete lack of respect for women's bodily autonomy. And that's the talk.